Hello, Sermon Brainwave listeners and viewers. This is Matt Skinner along with Karoline Lewis and Rolf Jacobson. We are inviting you to subscribe to a new e-newsletter on the Revised Common Lectionary that Working Preacher launched back in June.
So you get a free monthly word of inspiration from us, along with access to upcoming Sermon Brainwave episodes, commentaries, and resources related to preaching in the coming month. A new edition is sent out on the first Wednesday of each month.
So visit Working Preacher's homepage and click on the link under Good News for details. Sign up today.
Welcome to Sermon Brainwave with me, Matt Skinner.
And me, Karoline Lewis.
And me, Rolf Jacobson.
The second Sunday after Pentecost falls on June 22nd, 2025. And we have lots of texts. The first reading is Isaiah 65, 1 through 9. That's the thematic first reading. The semi-continuous first reading, 1 Kings 19, 1 through 15a, but 5 through 7 are optional. The psalm is Psalm 22, 19 through 28. The second reading is from Paul's letter to the Galatians, chapter 3, verses 23 through 29. And the gospel is Luke 8, 26 through 39. You know it's summertime, and we are past the summer solstice when you've got alternative readings.
Yes, back in the Old Testament, semi-continuous. So
Correct.
First thing we need to say is that the preacher has a lot of choices for this week. You can go back into Luke. We haven't been in Luke for a little bit.
Has been a while.
It's been a while. You could, there's always Isaiah. You could do a mini sermon series on Galatians. We have 3 in a row on Galatians, or you could dive into the semi-continuous and decide that that's going to be your sermon focus for the summer, is Elijah and Elisha.
Yeah, it's a bit of an odd start to all of them because you're getting the second half of an important story about Elijah. You're dropping in the middle of Galatians. This is all the moon's fault, I believe, in terms of how the Christian calendar gets set around Easter, but you have to do a little bit of explaining, but you're all able to do that. You know, we're getting prophets, right? All through year C, isn't that the...
Yeah, it was, yes.
Prophetic figures and prophetic literature.
So the semi-continuous Old Testament reading during ordinary time, year C is the end of the story. So
the end?
Meaning you're not in Genesis and Exodus, you're at the end of 1st and 2nd Kings, so the end of the story of Israel. Picking it up with Elijah, if you want to start there, or if you want to, we should probably start with the pigs. I'll have something to say about Elijah when we get there.
All right.
Sounds good.
I noticed he was looking at us when he said the pigs.
I like pigs. I'm a Midwestern person who grew up in farm country. You are not, so that's why I was looking at you with a certain amount of more familiarity with agriculture.
I enjoy asphalt, concrete. I feel comfortable when I'm surrounded by that.
You are a concrete jungle kind of person, or asphalt jungle.
Something like that. Great story, though, to drop in. If you want to fall back into the synoptics, no better story than this.
Right?
Well, and not just back into the story, but it's Jesus' first foray into Gentile territory in Luke.
Maybe.
Maybe?
Yeah.
What do you mean?
It could be.
Oh, okay.
All right. Keep going, though.
Well, and so it's not just, it's just not just you're in Luke, but you're put into a place where, okay, where is Jesus' mission? Where is Jesus' message going to go next? And what is that going to look like in Luke? And so here we are meeting the Gerasene demoniac whom he heals, and quite extraordinarily so. There's really a complete transformation of going from possessed and naked and not in his right mind to not possessed and clothed, and ends up being a witness for Jesus.
And everybody else undergoes a bit of a transformation too. The village does, because of what they are now faced with when they see him clothed and in his right mind. Right?
What are they faced with?
Well, that's where they grow scared. It's when they come, the people come to see what had happened. They find the man there sitting at Jesus' feet, clothed and in his right mind, and they became frightened. Mm-hmm. It's not they saw the pigs floating around and they got angry, and presented Jesus with an invoice or anything like that. It's there's something about seeing this man now obviously well that I think is terrifying, in part because it exposed or broken their only way of dealing with him, which is awful, but apparently from their point of view necessary. And now this guy's a living, walking reminder of a person, a condition, an oppression that they've been unable to deal with. Do you know what I mean? There's something about that I think it's like, oh, so he's going to come back and live with us now? And what else might change?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think that's an example of the way many of us learn to take our identity from, or to have our identity deeply impacted by some, like you just said, some sort of, you had a threefold, like oppression, bondage, suffering, or something like that. And it's actually becomes who you are. And then when it's taken away, both you and the other people who you are to them, they don't know what to do next. Many years ago, we were talking about this phenomenon with a class, and one of the students talked about having a basically alcoholic stepfather who then left. And this person said, well, that was a crappy identity I had, being the stepchild of an alcoholic. But then that was gone. I didn't know who I was. And so, I mean, just as an example of the way we might not like reality, but at least it's reality, something you can set your watch to. The guy in the graveyard is going to be crazy today, But then Jesus comes along and starts freeing people.
Yeah, I think there's clearly a danger. This comes out in the commentary of not making this about, say, mental health or something like that. But so we have to be careful with the analogies we draw. But every society has people or conditions that we simply don't know what to do with, and so we hide them, we relegate them, we pay people to take care of them in sometimes really inhumane, savage ways.
We try to medicate them.
Yeah. I mean, whatever you want to call it, whether you want to talk about the criminally insane, again, that's not what he is, so we have to be careful with these. But it's this, every society has things it cannot control and people it cannot control and behaviors it cannot control. And we do all we can to make them as invisible or out of the way as possible. And I think that's part of what's going on here, that Jesus is like, yeah, I'm not afraid of going to those places, and I can bring people back from those places.
Yeah. And there's pigs there.
I have a feeling you want to shift now to the livestock implications.
I do want to say something about it. I mean, so first of all, we have words like we were talking a couple of podcasts ago. I don't remember. I think it was maybe the word paraclete I was objecting to. Mm-hmm. And I wonder about the word demoniac this time. Like, if you use the word demoniac down on the corner of Como and Luther Place here, most people aren't going to know what you mean.
Where I grew up, no one's going to know what you mean when you say swineherd.
Exactly. I was going to go to that word too. Verse 34, swineherd, right? So in our translations, we tend to use it. But I was thinking maybe we should use person-forward language. So it's a person suffering from the condition of being possessed by a demon. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I was joking.
Oh.
Well, I mean, you can't say that. And Jesus met a person suffering from but it is actually right. So it's just, I mean, you could say it more easily. Here's somebody who is possessed by a demon, or in this case, a legion of them. The story has all these problems that people get hung up on. So the people with a little bit of like inner religious awareness will go, well, that's pretty mean. I mean, Jews don't eat pork, but their neighbors do, and now all these, that's a lot. That's a lot of money, first of all. That's millions of dollars, that many. If you lost a huge herd of swine, that's millions of dollars for instead of swineherd, I would say business people, right? These are business people who own, this is their life, they're hog farmers. That's what I would call them, not swineherds. But then there's the environmentalists. They got like, that's horrible for that lake to have all these dead animals, right? And so people and they start talking about this. It's kind of fun in the Bible study. And then after a while, they forget about the impossible oppression that this person has been experiencing. They want to talk about, even today in a Bible study, people want to talk about everything other than that.
Well, and then as I said earlier, it's not just a couple things about him. Or it's not only that Jesus takes the legion out of him, but he's once again clothed and safe. And then, of course, becomes he went away proclaiming throughout the city how much Jesus had done for him. So that's also just the miraculousness of this, is that those three aspects of his condition or of his reality are completely reversed by Jesus, and even more so. Mm-hmm. And particularly, you talked about identity, that he has a new identity as a testifier, as a witness, going from, man.
That's the key point.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks for making that.
Yeah, I think that Jesus has given him a new identity, and then that identity is for all to see. So it's not a private healing either. It's there he is with Jesus, and then it becomes even less private because of his witness. So I think those are important aspects of the text as well.
And there's also a kind of a political angle to it, perhaps, that people might have recognized in the ancient world. That for the demons to identify themselves as legion is interesting. So they use a Latin word that's been loaned into Greek that's used to describe the Roman military. So I think it can be anywhere from like 3,000 to 5,000 in a legion. Mm-hmm. You've got boars, or the wild boar was a symbol on the Roman military's flag in Judea and Galilee, I believe. You've got that. You've got a reference to the Gerasenes. Gerasa is nowhere near the Sea of Galilee, but it's a village that was leveled by the Romans in the first century.
That wasn't very nice.
Uprising. So
why'd they do that?
I'm just saying, when people want to feel bad for the pigs, think about what they might be symbolizing to people hearing this story.
Yeah.
The demons choose a way of identifying themselves with tremendous numbers and ferocity that deliberately appears to be recalling Roman strength in a region that knows too much of that. And so that's interesting too, in terms of what is Jesus showing power over. It's not a revolutionary text, but it's the symbolism in this.
Frankly, leaning into the following week too.
What's to come when he turns his face to Jerusalem.
Yeah.
When he goes back to home.
Yeah.
It's going to run into some Romans.
There's a ton here, and it's a story that I think I think preaching on demon possession is always a bit of a challenge, because people have a lot of questions and they want to know what are we talking about here. They want to reduce it, or they want to distract it, like ways you were talking about, Rolf. But it's, some people will see themselves in the demoniac in the sense of their own experience of liberation and freedom and wholeness. I think one of the tricks of the preacher is to help us see ourselves in the villagers who find this intrusion a little too scary. Like, we were comfortable with the ritual we had developed where we would have to chain this person up every night because that was the only way we could go to bed at night and feel safe. Mm-hmm. And what do you do then when that's proven to be, well, the guy proved it to be ineffective every time he broke free, but now ineffective in the sense that Jesus has transformed him. Anyway, a lot we could say there.
Yep.
I feel for the lectionary committee that looked at this text and said, we got to find something from the Old Testament that can kind of complement this. What should we do? And somebody said we could do Isaiah 65 that talks about sitting inside tombs and eating the flesh of pigs.
Must be.
And somebody said, is that the best you got? And they all looked at each other and they said, Yep.
It's
the best.
Yep.
Yeah, I don't like the pairing at all, but here you are. So this is it.
We don't make the lectionary, folks. We just interpret it.
We just criticize it.
We just comment on it.
That's a better way of putting it. The first thing that would be strange for people is figuring out who the I is. This is always a challenge through Isaiah 40 through 66. It's not a challenge here to figure it out, but it is just going to be a shock for people. I mean, that this is one where at least you ought to introduce it here. This is God speaking through the prophet. So, and it's weird. So it's almost a caricature of an old Lutheran sermon where you get 7 verses of condemnation. You can't earn salvation. You're bad. And then you get a verse of transition, which doesn't make any sense. Verse 8 about wine in a cellar. I was like, okay. And then, but I'll save some of the people. So that's okay. You're forgiven. Right. So I don't know what to do with this other than it's interesting text in its own, but it's not something that I would probably preach on.
Agreed.
Are we agreed?
Yeah.
Agreed. Yeah. Every once in a while, the lectionary makes those connections that are just you just don't quite understand, and that's fine. So let's do the alternate first reading, 1 Kings and Elijah.
Yeah, so I can't remember if it was 30 years ago now or something, but when they switched the way they do the Old Testament in ordinary time, so instead of having the first Sunday after Pentecost, now they have Oh, it's the Sunday after Pentecost between June 15th and 22nd or something like that. So the good thing about that is you get to the end of the story. Otherwise, you almost never got to the end of the Pentecost texts in the old way of doing it. Here, the problem is you're dropped down in the middle of stories. Mm-hmm. So especially when Easter is as late as it was this year. So you're starting, and Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done. Okay, there's your first half of your sermon is what's the all that Elijah has done. Elijah shows up in 1 Kings 17. I think it's not that hard of a pull to remind people of the story of the famine and then the story of the confrontation with the prophets of Baal at Mount Carmel, one of the great stories in the Old Testament. And then the first part, well, actually, this is what you get then. Then you get, after his greatest triumph, Elijah flees. And at least in part of this story, the question is whether you want to have the little angel showing up to give him the food that he can run on, or you just want to skip that detail and get him as fast as you can to Mount Horeb, which is Mount Sinai, so you can have this fantastic story of the theophany that is not a theophany, speaking of words that nobody knows what we mean. The revelation, the divine revelation, the God showing up is maybe best translation for theophany. And let me ask you guys a question about this. So you get this great verse. I'm in verse 11. There was a great wind so strong that it was splitting mountains and breaking rocks, but the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, and then here is the translation options. This one says a sound of sheer silence, or the old translation, a still small voice. Both of them are defensible.
What are you asking us how we would translate it?
What do you think?
Which one it is?
Yeah, it's how well you know Hebrew can't decide the matter. So that's why it's theological.
That's good.
Well, I mean, yeah, right?
We're just the people you need.
Right. Yeah, I mean, there's no Hebrew experts don't solve this for us. It's like I want to know Hebrew so I can precisely translate. Well, here's the bad news. Yeah, right?
Yeah. Sheer silence or a still small voice. Well, logically, still small voice, because it says then Elijah heard it. I don't know how but I think you can hear a silence.
Yeah.
Actually, I think you can hear silence. So I kind of like that better.
Okay. Yeah. I think it matters for how you tell the story. I think of our very dramatic retired colleague Craig Kester when he would do this story. I said to him, I could just see you doing this story, because when he would teach his big sweeping biblical narrative class, Genesis to Revelation, of course he would do this story. And he would actually get into it. And I'm not going to do it here, but there was a great wind. So strong, it broke rocks.
Then an earthquake.
Hold on. But the Lord was not in the wind.
Oh.
Then there was right? So, I mean, you get there with them. And then you have that silence. And after the fire, a sound of sheer silence. And then you got to let it breathe for a minute. And after the fire, a still small voice, and then you don't have to let it breathe because you just whisper it. But either way, it's that creating the moment. And one of the great things here is that some of these other things are ways God has shown up before. You know, God showed up in the fire that didn't consume the bush, and God showed up in the mountain, and then earthquake, a sense of God, of the terror of the divine presence. But here it's in a very small, whether it's silence or a whisper. It's good to know God's voice can come to us in different ways. And in this case, to reaffirm for Elijah, he's not alone.
Do you think that's is that a significant part of the story then? Is that the expectations of theophany that are then kind of thrown into question? Which I think that leads to a potential sermon there in terms of where do we expect manifestations of God. But it's also really quite poignant, or maybe, I don't know if I want to say disturbing, but that you can hear God in silence because so much of how we want to experience God is maybe not necessarily in wind and earthquakes that do what they do, but we want to hear God's voice.
Mm-hmm.
We want to hear God's word. We want to hear God speaking to us. I think we so equate God's revelation in our lives with that speaking. And then when there's silence, how that could really throw one. What do you do with that? Right?
Yeah, I like all this, that where we're going with this. I think to have this be the first Sunday of the alternate reading, moving into several months of looking at prophecy and prophets, is actually pretty fortuitous. I mean, because it gives us a chance to pause a bit and talk about the personality of a prophet and the vulnerability of a prophet. Elijah has just come off of his perhaps greatest career moment, right? In terms of courage and...
He just won the Masters.
Yeah, I mean, it's just this amazing experience, and he's very human, right? There's this experience of like, I'm just done. I can't do this anymore. I quit. Rather be dead. All of those kinds of things. So I don't want to psychologize him too much, but I really want people to get a sense before we start these months to think about the kind of people who are experiencing these revelations and these callings, and to see how their calling affects their whole bodies. I mean, some of this work has been done. Some of this is in Heschel's work, right, on the prophets. I haven't read it yet, but Anthea Portier-Young's got a new book on the prophets and embodiment. And so, I mean, how does this... The prophets will use their bodies, but they also feel this in their bodies, and they'll describe it, which means they feel it in their minds and their psyches. And so just to help us get a sense for them of being not as weird as we thought, but also at the same time, right? So deeply committed to this, so overtaken by their vision of God, holiness, righteousness, justice, whatever it's going to be from prophet to prophet. Do you know what I mean? And spend a little time with that and to press the question of what does that look like? We call the church a prophetic voice in culture. What does that look like corporately for us? What's our vision? What are our struggles? I mean, you can do some really interesting work, I think, if you're committed to this alternate reading for a period of time, if you devote some time, especially at the outset, but then drop in talking about prophetic bodies.
I think too, yes. And in fact, in preparation for today, I made myself a little note, and it said, if you don't preach these texts coming up, this particularly dropping here in Elijah, as a preacher, as a leader in the church, reflect on it for leadership in the church and your role. Yeah. And then I would say I would direct our listeners to Kimberly Rusaw's commentary and the way she talks about that, and particularly how this reminds us that our God is active and in motion in the midst of chaos, and I think there could be some resonance there as well. But I do think that could it be a place of spiritual renewal for leaders, just to focus on these you don't have to preach on them, but just say, I'm going to look at this prophet and how does it speak into my own ministry and my own role?
I know we talked a lot about this text, but I need a minute or two more. The first thing to say is one of the reasons that Elijah got himself into this place is he killed people. So at the end of 1 Kings 18, he has this great triumph that whose God will accept the offering of the bulls, right? And so it's Yahweh, and he will then be, the question there is, who will Israel follow as their God? Then Elijah kills the 450 prophets of Baal. God doesn't tell him to do that, but he thinks it's a good idea. And then that's what makes Jezebel mad, and he has to flee. I think that right now in our society, there's people who feel so righteous about their secular positions that they're feeling free to start to do violence. And it's across the spectrum. It's mostly on the extremes. But I think sometimes just normal people are getting caught up in just, rage and starting to do petty amounts of violence around. This might not be a text, maybe you do want to preach on that, but I do think Elijah has done something wrong here, namely killing 450 people in a fit of religious rage.
Yeah, I would not suggest that for
No,
readers
this
to
is
ponder.
bad. But it gives us a chance to talk about it. Again, maybe it's more of a Bible study or a staff devotion thing. But then you also have this he thinks he's the only faithful one. I think this is part of that problem. He says twice, I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and now they're seeking my life. And then God's like, yeah, no, you're not. You're not alone. You're not the only one. So the word of assurance is also a word of rebuke, and isn't that always the case with the Bible? With God is, no, you're really awesome, Elijah. We're glad to have you, but you're not alone.
Yeah, it says something about the prophetic mind as well,
Yeah.
right? That in terms of the cost on his own soul, perhaps.
Yeah,
That this is,
it's a good
and
way
of course,
to put
he
it.
bears some blame for that too, apparently. But
I would say so.
yeah,
I don't want to say anything about Psalm 22. We're already pretty late. I think
But you,
it's,
O Lord, do not be far away. There we go. There's the connection.
yeah, he heard when I cried to him.
Yeah.
All right, so
All right, done. Galatians.
yeah, let's talk about Galatians.
We have 3 weeks in Galatians, a short little stint,
well, and 3 great passages.
3
so there you
amazing
go.
passages. So there's that before we then start a series on Colossians. But yeah, this is a pretty important section of Galatians.
Yeah, and Brigitte Call is a great interpreter of Galatians, so we're fortunate to have her on the for the commentary, and so you'll learn a lot about Galatians from that. The lectionary skips over the really hard parts of Galatians, so you've got this. If anybody knows a verse from Galatians, it might be 3:28, and that's worth spending some time in. Here you get a sense of its context. It's through this idea of this radical unity that we share in Christ Jesus in particular. That's where we're located. That's our new identity. We talked about identity earlier on. For Paul, you have an identity. It's you are in Christ.
You are children of God.
And as a result, maybe the most important thing to preach here in a lot of contexts is all of this no longer this or that, no longer this or that, no longer male and female, isn't that those individual markers of who we are get dissolved away, but rather there's no hierarchy, there's no pecking order, no advantage from any of those. It's not saying, hey, we're all the same here, don't worry about it, but it's your differences are honored here and nobody gets to claim superiority.
And as she talks about, Rome rules by dividing. And that's,
Great line, yeah.
Rome rules by dividing. Society rules by dividing, but Jesus rules by uniting.
Sermon Brainwave is a production of Luther Seminary's Working Preacher. Working Preacher has been a trusted source of inspiration, interpretation, and imagination for preachers worldwide since 2007. Find episodes and links at workingpreacher.org/brainwave. And be sure to rate, subscribe, and comment on YouTube. Thanks for joining us.